Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's joint program between the Roundtable and the Archaeology Committee at the National Arts Club, discussing the Chroma, Ancient Sculpture in Color exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My name is Margaret Janicek. As many of you may know, the National Arts Club is a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to promote public interest in the arts. The club offers more than 150 free programs to the public annually. For more information about the club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many as we can after the presentation. On behalf of the Board of Governors, Roundtable Committee, and the Archaeology Committee, it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Sarah Lepinski. Sarah is an associate curator in the Department of Greek and Roman Art at the Metropolitan Museum. She joined the museum and the department in 2020. She is an experienced archaeologist and has conducted research projects and excavations in Italy, Greece, Cyprus, and Turkey, as well as Israel. And she has held fellowships at the J. Paul Getty Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. She received her doctorate in classical archaeology from Bryn Mawr College. So let us all welcome Sarah as she gives us insight into the Chroma Ancient Sculpture in Color exhibit at the Met. Please keep in mind that if you're in the New York City area, you can still visit the exhibit until March 26th. Again, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A, and we will get to as many as we can after the presentation. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm just trying to share my screen, so double tasking for just one moment, and then you'll let me know if everything is visible on my screen once I share it.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here today, and I'd like to thank Margaret and the Roundtable Committee, as well as the Archaeology Committee, for this kind invitation to speak with you all today virtually, to discuss the Chroma Ancient Sculpture in Color exhibition, which is currently on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Chroma exhibition presents color on ancient Greek and Roman sculpture and demonstrates how paint and gilding and inlaid materials animated and enlivened sculptures and reliefs, in marble and bronze and terracotta. Over time, the original materials used for these types of surface treatments in ancient statuary have disappeared. And without them, representations of humans and animals, as well as mythological subjects, become really devoid of their original definition and ornamentation. The Chroma exhibition highlights original color on works of art in the Met's collection and presents new discoveries of surviving color identified through scientific analysis and in-depth research by the Met's curatorial, conservation, scientific research, and imaging staff. And here I show one of the 60 works of art in the Met's collection that is included in the exhibition. And this is a 2nd century CE wellhead from the site of Ostia that still preserves traces of its original color. And you see on the bottom right an image presented in high magnification that with an arrow pointing to a small speck of pigment that was identified by our objects conservator D. Abramidis. A publication of this exhibition that you see here was just released this winter in the Metropolitan Museum of Art Journal, as you see in the center picture. Excuse me. The exhibition also features 17 striking color reconstructions of major sculptures created by Vinzenz Brinkmann, head of the Department of Antiquity at the Liebinghaus Sculptural Collection in Frankfurt, Germany, seen on the upper left of this image, and Ulrike Koch-Brinkmann on the lower left. This is a husband-wife team, archaeologists, with whom the Met has partnered for this exhibition. They're full-size reconstructions that you can see on display here in the right image on your screen. And these are from the previous iteration of installation in Frankfurt prior to the Met's exhibition. And you see how these full-size reconstructions capture and present a brilliance and really a broad scope of ancient color. The Brinkmann's work draws from a number of analytical approaches, and we'll be discussing those over the course of this presentation. And these include advanced photographic and spectrographic techniques. The more analytical techniques in their practice are combined with research and in-depth contextualization of the subjects pardon me. All of their, excuse me, all of the sculptures that their work concentrate on derive from museums across the globe, really, and we'll discuss that again as we proceed into the presentation as well. So since 2003, so 2003, the Brinkmann's reconstructions have traveled to more than 20 different venues as part of their Gods in Color exhibition. And these venues have included Berlin and San Francisco, Munich, Copenhagen, and many more. A selection of the Gods in Color exhibition catalogs are shown here on your screen, just to give you a sense of the variety and also the longevity of the Brinkmann's Gods in Color show. The Chroma exhibition is a departure from the Gods in Color exhibition, however. Really, from its conception, Sean Hemingway, the John A. and Carol O. Moran curator in charge of the Department of Greek and Roman Art, and I, as curators of this exhibition, sought to foreground the long history of the Met's work to study and present ancient polychromy on the one hand, and also to contextualize the Brinkmann's modern reconstructions of ancient sculpture within the scope of the Met's collection. And I show here one view of the exhibition in the end of our south end of our Greek galleries at the Met. The exhibition is also a new format for our department in that the reconstructions are not displayed in a specially prepared exhibition space in the museum, but instead are interspersed throughout the museum's permanent galleries of Greek and Roman art, juxtaposed with juxtaposed with original works that depict similar subjects. The exhibition really, in this respect, provides a window into multiple aspects of color on ancient sculpture. Over time, certainly, and in the sweep of our chronological sweep of our galleries, and in the different types of media that I mentioned earlier, marble, bronze, terracotta, and other types of stone. The exhibition also explores a number of themes, in particular the materials and practices used by ancient artists. Also, the methods employed for revealing, identifying, and reconstructing or recreating original color on ancient sculpture. And ultimately, we are striving to explore the critical role that color played in conveying meaning in antiquity and ancient contexts, and the various ways that people have viewed and understood Greek and Roman polychromy over the centuries. So for today's presentation, I wanted to highlight these themes that I just listed, and I'll come back to them and reinforce them over the course of the presentation. But I want to highlight the themes of the exhibition and then sort of set the stage for dialogue and for a robust discussion after my presentation. The first overarching theme therein encompasses the history of the study of ancient sculptural color. As a modern field of study, color in ancient sculpture really commenced in the early 19th century in Europe. In fact, the term used to describe the phenomenon, you've heard me use it already a couple times in the presentation, the term polychromy, which is used to describe surface treatments and color in ancient art, was derived from the modern Greek, poly meaning many, and colors, chroma meaning colors. It was coined by a French archaeologist and theorist, Antoine Chrysostome Catlemer-Quincy, in a publication of his study of the famous ancient artisan Phidias, classical Greek artist Phidias. In his study of Phidias's celebrated and multimedia statue of Zeus of Olympia, which you see here rendered on the frontispiece of his publication, and it's in watercolor here on the left. On the right, you see a portrait of Catlemer-Quincy. The Met's long tradition of scholarship in the field of polychromy is highlighted throughout the exhibition as well, and sort of builds on this basis of the field at large. Edward Robinson, a classicist by training and the museum's third director on the left, was deeply interested in the subject of color in ancient sculpture as early as the 1890s, when he was engaged in his travels. At that point, he was at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he was traveling to Europe as a part of his duties for that museum. And he was deeply engaged in academic debates regarding the existence and the extent of applied color on ancient sculpture and architecture. I see a hand up. Should I pay attention, Margaret, to that hand, or should we wait till after?
Just wait till after.
Oh, okay. I just saw it up on you. I have only 3 tiles here, excuse me, but
Okay.
we'll wait for after. Okay, great. Thank you. So he was, as I mentioned, in his travels in the 1890s in Europe, discovering and becoming deeply engaged in what was quite a rampant discussion of whether color was applied to ancient sculpture and architecture in antiquity. And during Robinson's tenure at the the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we acquired many Greek sculptures with surviving color as a result of his interest and his publications and his engagement in this topic. And many of these objects are also featured in the exhibition. Equally fundamental to this story and for the early field of polychromy studies in North America and the Met was the work of Gisela M.A. Richter, seen here in a photograph on the right. She was an esteemed curator of Greek and Roman art in her department, and she studied and published extensively on color on Greek artworks, including the archaic Sphinx that crowned a grave marker of a young Athenian, of which a tremendous amount of focus for the exhibition has taken place, and this monument is a highlight of our exhibition in many respects. You see it here in this image of our Greek archaic gallery, and this time period this is roughly from the 7th to the 6th century BCE, i.e. 700 to around 500 BCE. This monument serves as a key piece in the exhibition and was a focus of our research and our collaboration with the Brinkmanns. The archaic period marble finial of the Sphinx that's seen here in the gallery in the case on the right once crowned this monument. Today, the gallery displays the monument with a plaster cast on top, and this is for safety reasons, but also so that visitors are able to see the extant polychromy on the Sphinx here on the right in closer proximity. And you see here on the left of this image the reconstruction with the reconstruction of our Sphinx finial that we worked so easily and well with the Brinkmanns to create. The sculpture of the mythical creature seen here in detail on the left, the Sphinx that you just saw in the display case in the previous slide, it portrays a Sphinx, which in Greek mythology took the form of a composite creature with a lion's body and the wings and breast of a bird, and a human head, typically female in Greek mythology. Its function in antiquity really was to serve as a guardian over the dead, or one of its many functions. The original colors on our work of the Sphinx, the reds and the blues and the black and also a yellow, were used to delineate her composite features and to emphasize the patterning of these different characteristics of the various animals and the human that she portrayed. You see here on the right the detail of the diadem of the human head of the Sphinx that is seen more easily seen, the polychromy, the color, and the patterning. It's a meander pattern that's seen with projected light through the transparency of the marble. The study of colors has been, and the colors of this piece in particular, which is it's fair to say unique in archaic period art, with the extent of polychromy that's extant on the surface of this piece. It's been a focus of study by Gisela Richter and others, including scientists at the Met, since it was acquired by the museum in the late 1930s. And this current project in the exhibition, again, brought together a collaborative team of scientists and curators, imaging specialists, as I mentioned earlier, and also conservators, to study and build on the work of our predecessors, albeit now with much more advanced technologies. The art department's technicians, and this is just a couple of slides to give you some of the background and to image or visualize the extent of work that went into the research that we conducted on the Sphinx. It began first in our galleries, and you see our department technicians on the left constructing a black box around the sculpture, and you see that in the middle of our archaic galleries here on in the upper segment of your screen. This black box was created so that our object conservator, D. Abramidis, who specializes in ancient marble sculpture, could examine the surface of the Sphinx in a number of different light conditions. And these included visible induced infrared luminescence, or VIL, which you see the result of in the upper right, which basically makes visible traces of an ancient synthetic pigment called Egyptian blue. And you see in this image with this light condition with the infrared, that the Egyptian blue is luminescing into a light white color. You see on the bottom right, in comparison with with the wing feathers, and this is a detail of the wing of the bird, of the Sphinx, excuse me, that other blue pigments, this is the Egyptian blue area, and other blue pigment, which is a blue azurite, is visible to the eye, where the areas of luminescence were only visible in certain light conditions. This is one of the many approaches that we took to studying the surface and pigments of this Sphinx. We worked closely with Dee and also with our colleagues in scientific research, Federico Caro, Elena Basso, and Marco Leona, to identify areas to take microsamples so we could identify the actual pigments that were used on the Sphinx's patterning. You see here, you see at the examples at the bottom of the screen of cinnabar from the crown, azurite from the center. So this is azurite, this is cinnabar, and these are all taken from the crown that I showed a couple slides ago, that was that you could see the meander pattern through with just a raking light. And then, excuse me, on the right, an iron-based red ochre from the lips on the right. These were all taken at 200 times magnification, just to give you a sense of the degree of magnification of the surface that we need to make these ancient colors visible to our eyes today. In one case, on the lower right, on the upper right, excuse me, right here, Federico was able to get a slightly larger sample from the Sphinx's hair. And this shows how the paint was applied directly onto the marble and then covered with accretions. And this is the accretion layer here. And this is a significant discovery for our questions of how ancient sculpture was painted during this period of time in Greece. The project was far more complex and collaborative than any other project we've undertaken in the Greek and Roman department to date. We worked really closely with our colleagues in object conservation and scientific research, as I mentioned, but also in imaging. Our colleagues in our imaging department made a 3D scan of the Sphinx and helped to model the colors of the digital reconstruction, which I'll get to in a minute. And we also worked very closely with digital media, with whom we created an augmented reality experience, which I'll also describe in a little bit later in our presentation. We had meetings in person, as you see here, with our colleagues, our various colleagues in the Met, and here you'll recognize Vincent Brinkman, Ulrike Koch-Brinkmann, who came to visit at least twice over the course of our 2-year period of study of the Sphinx. Our director, Max Hollein, also stopped by to gauge the progress of our research together. And then when at the depths of COVID, we were really meeting quite frequently on Zoom to share information and to share research questions so that each group or team, one in Frankfurt and one here, could follow up on various research questions we had. Now, the new reconstruction of the archaic period Sphinx brings all of our research together, and in a characteristic fashion for the Brinkmanns, it goes beyond what was determined through strictly scientific research. And you see this state, which is the result of our internal research and conservation teams, sort of the state of where the science and the identification of the pigments stops really. And then you see a final version at the right, which really builds together with the scientific analyses, or the results of the scientific analyses, art historical and archaeological comparanda to offer a nearly complete reconstruction. And this is the goal on the Brinkmanns' part, to offer an impression and a completeness to certain extents of what an ancient work of art might have looked like in antiquity. And these finishing touches included both a finial on top of the head and gold foil at the center of the wing. And you can really imagine these additional elements being quite reflective in the ancient Mediterranean sun. As I noted earlier, the project included an augmented reality experience that centered on the Sphinx. The project highlighted the original work of art, and you see here, sorry, on the left, this was primarily for promotional purposes, but also an exciting project to spearhead augmented reality features for the museum in general. This was sort of the first time we've engaged in this type of project associated with an exhibition, to my knowledge. And you see the QR code here on the left, and it was intended to offer some information about the project, about the Sphinx, about the original and also the reconstruction, and to pique interest in visiting the exhibition. And I think we've had a lot of good feedback from this project. On the right, you see the model of a second 3D model that was created by our imaging team of the finished reconstruction. So we had a 3D model of the original and one of the finished reconstruction to highlight in this feature. It brought together, again, our team, curators, scientists, conservators, imaging specialists who worked with our digital department and also with an outside design firm, Blue Cadet. And again, it's available through the QR code on our website and also in stanchions in the galleries. So The role of reconstructions for understanding and presenting manifestation of ancient color is an important theme in the exhibition, as you've experienced already. And the exhibition worked to highlight the variety of formats that were employed to document and present ancient sculptural polychromy. And in this case, a more historical reconstruction in a watercolor that dates to the end of the 1st century and early 20th century. Observations of archaeologists and artists working in early excavations in Greece and Italy in the 19th and 20th centuries were often represented in this format, in watercolor on paper and also in written descriptions. A watercolor rendering shown here on the left by the Swiss artist and archaeological draftsman Émile Gilleron meticulously really represents vibrant colors of red, blue, black, green, and yellow that were extant on limestone sculptural, these are from a pedimental sculpture from the Athenian Acropolis that were excavated in 1888. He was on site when they were excavated and was able to document the preserved color as it came out of the ground. You see on the right the reconstructed sculpture which is now in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. The scene likely decorated a small building that stood on the Acropolis in the 6th century BCE, and it shows Zeus and Hera, the god Zeus and the goddess Hera, enthroned and receiving the hero Heracles from a scene from Mount Olympus. Gilleron's half-scale watercolor reveals the exceptionally fine and intricate detail of the garments and the throne and the footstool that were visible to him at the time in the late 19th century. This is a period of time in which classical sculpture and architecture was visualized in terms of white marble more broadly across a public's and also the specialist perception of ancient antiquity. And Gilleron's representations introduced color and the complexity therein in certain ways to a broad audience and broad audiences in museums across the world. We at the Met commissioned this. Ms. Richter commissioned this in 1919. It's one of a number and a series that we have, and also that are in other institutions. So the reconstruction of watercolor, the use of watercolor for color reconstructions, was an important tool in the late 18th and early 20th century for museum audiences across the world. In many respects, the Brinkmann's work in their full-size physical three-dimensional reconstructions continues the tradition of creating full-size models of ancient sculptures in plaster physical casts. And these have historically been made for private and public collections since the Renaissance period. The Met has a large collection, and there are large collections across museums across the world. The casts, like the cast of the Sphinx we saw earlier on top of our grave stele, were rarely painted, however. And so this is a distinction that we're now, with the Brinkmanns, bringing together both the paint and the physical cast. Today, also digital tools increasingly facilitate the rendering and reimagining of ancient polychromy in both 2 and 3 dimensions. So the three representations shown here offer distinctive interpretations of the original painting processes and the preserved color on a Roman head carved of Parian marble, which is now in the collection of the British Museum. The head has played a fundamental role in the history of ancient polychromy studies since the late 19th century, when German archaeologist Georg Treu published his investigations of its preserved color. And this publication you can see pictured in a watercolor rendering in the center of the slide. Once likely set into a statue of Minerva or Venus, the head retains extensive pigment traces, including those used for flesh tones. And these are parts of ancient sculpture that are rarely identified today, are the flesh tones of ancient sculpture. More recently, conservation scientist Giovanni Veri and his colleagues analyzed the surviving paint on the head in the British Museum using non-invasive non-invasive imaging techniques, and other analytical methods. The results of these, and a number of different methods again, the results of these analyses informed both reconstructions on either side of the screen here. They informed the Brinkmann's full-size physical study of the color scheme on the right, as well as the digital rendering by Giovanni on the left. This digital reconstruction presents his, as well as his interpretation, that is Dr. Giovanni's interpretation of his key discoveries through science, his scientific discoveries, as well as his interpretation of original Roman painting techniques being aligned with practices used in Roman Egypt that are found in contemporary panel painting and the larger corpus of what are sometimes called Fayum paintings, of which the museum has a number in our Egyptian department. These are typically painted on two-dimensional surfaces on wooden panels. So again, the point here was really to drive home or emphasize the different interpretations and aesthetics, and how interpretations take different form and therefore are received in different ways. And we're happy to talk about this again at the end of the presentation. And it was an important theme that we tried to sort of weave through parts of this exhibition. So representations of artists painting ancient sculpture also provide insights into painting practices and techniques in antiquity. And the main scene on the terracotta column crater here on the left shows an ancient painting of a marble statue of the hero Heracles in the presence of both the god Heracles and the god Zeus, or the hero Heracles and the god Zeus above. The painter, who's portrayed here on the right, is using the encaustic technique, where he applies a mixture of pigment and wax together. And you see him applying with the spatula on the right color to the lion pelt, Heracles' famous lion pelt. A young assistant tends the brazier, and you see a box of artist's materials here on the right. The applied color to this terracotta crater, which is executed in the red figure technique, highlights the white marble and the yellow or golden hair of Heracles, which are important aspects of representing and indicating that it's a white marble sculpture that's being painted by the painter. And then an intaglio gemstone represents a seated artisan painting a female portrait bust on the right. You see here that the artist holds a brush in his right hand and a flat palette in his left, and the tools demonstrate that he uses the tempera technique in contrast to the wax-based technique of the painter on the left. And he's probably applying pigment to this portrait head with a binding material, which could be egg or gum arabic or even an animal glue, as we understand from our primary sources. Now, the interplay of color and medium in polychrome sculpture also features heavily across the exhibition, and in particular with the use of different colored marbles used in Roman sculptural practices. And I highlight them briefly here to emphasize that color was applied and color in ancient sculptural practices, but color was also inherent within the materials used for ancient sculpture and had a conscious impact or effect, or was intended to achieve certain effects in ancient sculptural aesthetics and reception. And you see here on the right a fragment of a torso of a centaur that is carved out of rosso antico, a widely distributed red marble with only a handful of quarry sites throughout the Roman world, and was popular for a number of reasons, if primarily its deep red color. And here it renders the wild mythical creature of a centaur. In the center, we have a gray black hard stone that's quarried in Egypt, and it's called Greywacke. And then on the left, a white head of a deity wearing a Dionysian headband, in which the flesh tones and the flesh surface treatment and the hair are treated very differently. And so the marbles being used in this rendering of the deity in very important ways. And then also material of bronze was used in incredibly sophisticated ways in Greek sculpture. And in the exhibition, we have two sets of bronze sculptures, of reconstructions of bronze sculptures that are featured throughout the exhibition. The first is in the classical galleries and is a rendering of two warriors dating to the 5th century BC. And then here in the Roman court, we see two original Greek bronze statues reconstructed. The originals were discovered on the Quirinal Hill in Rome in 1885 near the Baths of Constantine, the ancient Baths of Constantine. And they're now in the Palazzo Massimo al Terme in Rome. Visual and scientific analyses of these original sculptures in Rome by the Brinkmanns have revealed extensive surface treatment and applied color. The standing figure on the left leans on a spear in a very heroic pose, while the boxer on the right sits with his arms resting on his knees, his head turned to his right and slightly raised in an engaging connection between the two figures. The identification and relationship of the figures to one another really remains unresolved to date, although here the Brinkmanns rely on an older 1940s line of interpretation and suggest that the figures represent characters in an account from Jason and the Argonauts, where the standing Polydoicus or Pollux, the son of Zeus, has defeated Amycos, the son of Poseidon, on the right in a boxing match, and now urges him to refrain from murdering strangers with his deadly knuckles. And you see this deadly knuckles wrapped. Both statues display the swollen ears of the fighter, as well as multiple wounds from their combat. So an interplay of medium and meaning is also seen in these three works, which each reference different moments in the story of the Judgment of Paris, both in ancient and Renaissance portrayals. The scene on the oil flask on the left depicts the Greek messenger god Hermes nude. In the foreground, his pose and the black glaze used to render his skin may refer to a bronze sculpture. We're not sure, but it certainly seems to be an interplay or a play of representation here by the artisan. The bronze statuette of Aphrodite with silver inlaid eyes in the center really captures the goddess at a moment of contemplation as she looks at her prize. This is a prize for, of course, for being the fairest of all Greek goddesses. It was once gilded, as we understand from multiple stories. And it was awarded to her by the Trojan prince Paris. And the exquisite 16th century, CE figure of Paris on the right represents this Trojan prince at a different moment, as he sort of perhaps deliberates before he gives the golden apple to Aphrodite. In this rendering on the right, the Italian sculptor Antico revitalizes Greek and Roman subjects throughout his work, but in this one in particular. And you see this in the contrast of the bronze skin and the hair, for instance, and the gilding and the silver of the eyes. But he takes it steps further with this sort of elegantly chased hair that on one hand offers a sense of an unknown ancient prototype, but on the other really reveals sort of a virtuosity of his own bronze making techniques taken to new levels of artistry, and also for a Renaissance audience in 16th century Mantua. So the influence of ancient polychromy in the art of Renaissance Italy and later European and North American art is an important theme throughout the exhibition, and one that we are featuring within one of 5 sessions in a 2-day public symposium, which will be held next week, March 24 and 25, in the Met's Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium. This symposium really builds on the major themes of the exhibition, and it brings together a multidisciplinary and international group of scholars. And again, this is across expertise and disciplines, including art historians, conservators, imaging specialists, scientists, and conservators, to build on the exhibition's offerings in a way to further explore the practices and materials used by ancient artists with the presentations of other projects and in the field more broadly. It'll also take up the theme of the major and critical role of color in conveying meaning in different contexts across antiquity, across cultural groups, and across geographies. It features a session on the various ways that people have created, viewed, and understood polychromy over the centuries, and offers various threads of reconstructions and the utility and function and goals of reconstructions of different ancient artworks for public, for study, and in different formats moving into the future, such as in digital formats that we experimented with our AR feature. So at this point, I would wish to thank you for your attention, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you might have.
So Sarah, thank you so much on behalf of the National Arts Club, the Roundtable, and the Archaeology Committee for your time. I have some really great questions, and I'm going to actually kick it off with a question from the chair of the Archaeology Committee, Michelle Kidwell-Gilbert, and she's asking, will the Metropolitan's reconstruction of the Parthenon be altered due to this excellent research?
Thank you for that question, Michelle. I really appreciate it. Our Parthenon model, it's famous in some of our archival pictures, is now in a museum in Munich. It's on loan, long-term loan to Munich, where it's in a cast museum. And we will have a scholar here at the symposium. And I apologize, I realized that I didn't update that slide. I can send and in fact, maybe in the chat, the links to the Chroma symposium schedule's already been sent around by Nadine. But the head of that cast museum will be here speaking about the Parthenon and about its historical reconstructions. They might be engaging in restoration of the piece, and that's an important topic. How do you restore our recreations? I mean, I think that's all, part of a larger conversation that we will have. At this point, we haven't done much restoration on the piece, although that's certainly part of a larger conversation that we're having. Thank you for that question.
Okay, our second question is, there were a couple of questions around, someone had visited South India and saw current Hindu temples and gates and noticed how colorful they were. And another one was about Egyptian statuary. So on a global sort of cultural, does this reflect back to the reason we can assume these were colored, were painted?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think what we've understood is that there are cultural connections, for instance, between the ancient Greeks in the geometric and archaic periods, the same time period as our Sphinx finial, really, where we can really culturally understand, and much earlier too, from the 2nd millennium BC on, but discrete points in history where we have these very concrete connections where we can say that, for instance, Greek art was being influenced by Egyptian art, and that is extant in the archaic period, or or results in archaic period representations for sure. And so there is a connection there, but there are very different, but they become very different traditions, and they were very different traditions before, with sort of crossover influences at different times and places and areas. So with Egypt in particular, which is in closer proximity to Greece and Rome later, I would say Italy, than South Asia, we can really chart those connections and talk about where different traditions were in fact influenced by exchanges of ideas and knowledge, interactions of artisans and other peoples. I don't know a lot about the painting on Hindu temples, but I do know that they were extremely painted in a very sophisticated manner, and appropriate to cultural interests and of course contextual interests. So that would be a question for someone else who could do better justice to it than I can. But certainly as we engage in more research, we're seeing broader, I think we could say, material-based connections between geographic and geological sources that could inform that question a little bit more concretely, whether similar geological sources were being used, say, at similar times by different cultural groups. I don't know, and this would be a question for my colleagues, but I don't know if we're there yet in terms of our data sets on the geological sources at this point. But thank you for that question. And I don't mean to keep pitching the symposium, but we will have colleagues working on Central American art presenting at our symposium, which will bring that same global question into a larger conversation. And I'm trying to think, and then certainly ancient Western Asian art historians.
This symposium sounds fascinating. So I'm going to actually ask you maybe a little bit of a controversial question, but there were a couple of things in the chat. So this was, have you received, or the department received, pushback around the idea of these, the polychromy and the difference in what are aesthetic feelings of what it should look like, and then after all this time telling us that it actually didn't, it was looked completely different. In fact, someone wrote this, and it was she wrote it very beautifully. I had such a difficult time parting with the convention of news beige coloring of antiquities. These colors seem so jarring with no subtlety of shading or gradation of hue. And so I know that we've talked about this. So do you want to kind of address that? I think that one of our participants really put that nicely.
Thank you. No, and that is, I've had a lot of conversations about this. Margaret and I have had wonderful conversations about this topic, and it is. I mean, so with the Brinkmanns, I think the Brinkmanns reconstructions, I have to say, are probably the most profound manifestations of ancient color that we have now to use in these contexts of enabling the discourse, right? Presenting vibrant and intensely colored interpretations based on a number of different, the results of a number of different analytical approaches, including deep art historical knowledge and cultural contexts. But they're an impression, and this comments of shading and subtlety come up quite frequently in our in tours that I give, and in previous scholarship, in reviews of earlier Gods in Color exhibitions. It's been very much a part of the discourse, and it's important. The Brinkmanns offer their perspectives and their interpretations on the basis of the depth of their knowledge, and that's why one of the themes was, or one of the purposes behind the presentation of Giovanni's digital reconstruction, for instance, was to get at that question in a way to show a different and completely different interpretation and aesthetic experience in two-dimensional reconstruction with digital media. So sort of to get at that, well, there are other ways of understanding that scholars and scientists have offered for us to consider. I think also it's our interpreted lenses are as they've been structured and constructed over our own experiences and our own time with these objects, and that's been spent with objects that are primarily monochrome, primarily or primarily devoid of the textures and the vibrancy of color and metal alloys, and so for sure I think everyone has their own approach and their own I think responses to these, and I think there's room to consider all of those.
I found it for myself, the more I looked at them, the more they made sense. But just seeing it on initial shock when I first saw it, but really sitting with it helped a lot and was eye-opening. I have actually now a super easy question for you. Ready?
Yes.
Will the symposium be live streamed? And if not,
yes.
It will.
It will, and if the links went out, so they don't have to register for live streaming, it'll just be on the page. Both days will be live streamed, and then it'll be hosted on our YouTube, the Met's YouTube channel. So we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. And we know we have a number of colleagues in different countries at different time zones. And oh, thank you very much. So you see the link there, there for both day 1 and day 2. In physical attendance, we ask that you register just so that we can make sure we don't overpack the auditorium.
So when you say YouTube, you mean that it's live streamed, it'll then be taped and be up on the Met's YouTube. Is that correct?
Thank you, Margaret. Yes, that's much more, that's a clearer way of stating it. So initially it'll be only live streamed, and then it'll be accessible later on our YouTube channel.
Okay. And I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. I just want you to know I have 32 questions, and I apologize for everyone if I'm unable to get to everyone's 33 questions today, but hopefully if you can register for the symposium, either in live stream, YouTube, or however some of those other questions will be addressed. There was an interesting one about, here we go, about how the color was applied. Were the colors ever blended? Were they thought to be blended for a more naturalistic sort? And were there reasons that certain colors were indicated? Like what I noticed is that some of the sphinxes blended around the skin tone, and then others were highlighted in primary. Were there reasons for that? And then I'm just trying to were certain colors indicative of status, and were there different colorings for different stones, different methodologies for different stones? And I'm sorry, I gave you like 4 questions at once.
Okay, if I forget one, let me remind me if you don't mind. So in terms of, we have a really good sense that gold was important, and so that in its sense we have that through our texts analyses, and in fact there's new work being done by scholars on really digging into primary sources, ancient literature, and epigraphic sources to identify color and references to color, and that helps us understand the status of color. The status was probably also and not completely, you can't separate the status of the color and the visual experience from perhaps the value of the material itself, which is important to consider when we think about status. For instance, we have the cinnabar very, very early on in the 3rd millennium BC being used on ancient sculpture in the Cyclades, and those are a series of islands in the Mediterranean, with a very distinctive culture group that made these beautiful marble figurines, and many of these figures have cinnabar is being used as a pigment to portray features, but also then other elements of patterning that might not completely be understood. But the cinnabar, my point is, the cinnabar is being transported from long distances because it wasn't original to the island. So then the value, if we think, and this is it's a big field within the larger field of classical art and archaeology, but the value of it is, you know, economic as well as cultural. So you have this interplay there between those two. In terms of blending, yes, we're getting a much better sense in the archaic period in Greek art that the blending of pigments was much more prevalent than we've understood previously. And that's come through some of our research on the Sphinx for sure, but also on other objects where we've been able to identify multiple pigments being used in a blend, in a mixture. And you can see when you look at the very high magnification that images that our research scientists produce, you can see what might be applied over being, you know, layers of application in contrast to a blended pigment. So you have a sense of the practice of the pigment blending practice, even from these little small micro samples that we take very sparingly in our work. The other question was about, I think there's a fourth one there.
Here, was there a fourth one? Blended, I think you got all of it.
Okay.
I think that there was...
Another factor that's, I think it was one more thing I was going to say, excuse me, but that we do have a sense of the shift of painting practices over time. So I say that we're understanding more about the way that artists were blending pigments in the archaic period from our current work, but we also have understood for longer that 2-3 centuries later in Hellenistic Greek art that the blending was prevalent, and other materials at that point were used, other materials for pigments, for instance, materials such as madder lake, which was primarily used for dyeing, is also being used as a pigment and produces this vibrant, so it's a madder root that's been used as a pigment. And at that point too, in terracotta figurines and their painting, we have other dye elements such as lichen and kermes, this little insect being used. So the palette is expanding to include other colors from other sources outside geological mineral sources, and that special pigment I noted as Egyptian blue, which is a synthetic pigment.
Well, this has been such a fantastic talk. I know I can tell by the chat and that it's been very, very well received. I want to remind everyone that we can, today's recording of today's program will be seen at the National Arts Club at Home series, and the link is on the chat of our YouTube channel. As Sarah had said, the Met is having a symposium to further discuss these works, and that is also in the chat. And lastly, if anybody's joining us that is interested in becoming a member, you should write us at admissions@thenationalartsclub.org. And thank you again for your time, Sarah, and for this fascinating topic. And I hope everybody has a lovely day. I can also tell you that we had a global community today. So that's so wonderful.
Thank you very much.